1944. World War II was reaching its dramatic climax.
Rocket ships firing, aircraft flying overhead.
As the Allies waged total war to liberate occupied Europe.
This was a war in which all sides were learning as they went.
From the beaches of Normandy,
the water was full of blood. The water was bright red.
To the forests of Germany.
Ich sehe dort heute noch die ganzen Toten liegen.
Both sides deployed weapons of ever greater power and sophistication.
And this tank suddenly gives the American a real big advantage. It's a very effective beast.
This is the story of the Western Allies' final campaign, told by the men on both sides who were there.
You did what you did. You fire and you maneuver.
He was my brother.
In September 1944, as American troops reached the German frontier, they faced a bitter struggle to break through a massive network of defenses that stretched from the Netherlands in the north to Switzerland in the south, known to the Allies as the Siegfried Line.
Und wir sagten uns, wir verteidigen hier, weil die Amerikaner praktisch in unser Heimatland eingedrungen sind.
It would be the longest continuous battle fought by the US Army in World War II, with a devastating physical and psychological toll on its troops. This is the story of the battle for the Siegfried Line. By the autumn of 1944, Hitler's Germany was under direct attack on two fronts. On the Eastern Front, Stalin's Red Army had advanced as far as Poland and Romania. In the West, British and American-led forces were nearing the German border and preparing to attack along a broad front to break through into the German homeland. In the Allies' path lay the Siegfried Line, known to Germans as the Westwall, a belt of fortifications stretching nearly 400 miles from the Netherlands to the Swiss border.
The Westwall, or as the Allies called it, the Siegfried Line, was a German defensive structure erected in the interwar period, mainly in the 1930s, on the German-French border as a defensive measure to protect German territory against the French. It was only in 1944 that the Germans realized or remembered that they had this defensive structure. The problem was that the defenses were inadequate, and they also hadn't been maintained, and so the Westwall offered a little bit of support to the Germans, but it was not the threatening defensive line that the Allies thought it was.
Very much as with the Atlantic Wall, areas were stronger or weaker, but it did at least provide the Germans with fortifications on which they could rest for the winter of 1944-45.
As the Allies drew near, the Germans worked hurriedly to reinforce the Siegfried Line defenses. They had the potential to pose a formidable obstacle. A fortified zone of concrete bunkers and pillboxes, minefields, barbed wire, and concrete obstacles known as dragon's teeth that were impassable to tanks.
I remember the Siegfried Line very easily as we were coming up to it. It was a lot of concrete emplacements already there, waiting for somebody to attack. And there were underground passages connecting these to them, and they had a lot of artillery firing at us.
The Allies needed to bust through these defenses to advance into Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr. But to everyone's surprise, on the 11th of September 1944, a US patrol approached a section of the Siegfried Line near the German-Luxembourg border and found it deserted. Within hours, they'd become the first US troops into Germany, without a shot fired. The commander of US 7th Corps, saw an opportunity too good to miss and drew up a plan to break through the Siegfried Line before the Germans could reinforce it. That commander was General Lightning Joe Collins. Joseph Lawton Collins was one of the few generals to see action in both the European and Pacific theatres of war, having commanded an infantry division during the Battle of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands in 1943. His division's nickname in the Pacific, Tropic Lightning, led to his own nickname, Lightning Joe. Just before the D-Day landings, General Eisenhower gave the 47-year-old Collins command of 7th Corps, making him the youngest Corps commander in the U.S. Army.
He was a very aggressive, very smart guy who modeled himself to a certain extent on George Patton, and was one of the new wave of much less cautious, much less methodical American general officers who were beginning to appear at that point in the war.
Collins' 7th Corps was one of 3 that made up General Courtney Hodges' U.S. First Army. 7th Corps had 2 highly experienced infantry divisions, the 1st and 9th, which had both seen action in North Africa, Sicily, and Normandy, while the 3rd Armoured Division had been in combat since June and was boldly and aggressively led by General Maurice Rose. Collins turned to General Rose's 3rd Armoured to lead the attack through the Siegfried Line, with the division operating as 2 combat commands, A and B.
The American combat command system started up in the 1930s and into the 1940s, and it was at least in part a reaction to the new requirements of industrialized warfare. The Americans discovered that they didn't always need full-size divisions to do everything that they were thinking about, or that full-size divisions didn't have everything they needed within them. And so what they started to do was put together combat commands, which might draw from an armored division, draw from an infantry division, an artillery, an engineer division, and put together units as one big fighting force, commanded by someone who could use them in whatever way was best.
The initial American penetration of the Siegfried Line had been made just south of Aachen. Now, 3rd Armoured's 2 combat commands would attack northeast, near the German town of Hürtgen. Once the tanks had broken through, they'd continue the advance to Stolberg, while 1st Infantry Division swung left to capture the high ground east of Aachen, and 9th Infantry pushed into the Hürtgen Forest to secure 7th Corps' right flank. On the 12th of September, Combat Command A and B began their advance against the Siegfried Line. With tanks providing fire support, infantry working their way forward to outflank pillboxes and bunkers, and engineers clearing obstacles, the Americans began fighting their way through the fortified zone. Over 4 days of combat, the 3rd Armoured advanced an average of 2 miles a day, fighting its way methodically through the belt of defences. But as US troops neared Stolberg, they ran into a second chain of Siegfried Line defences, at the same time as they were hit by a series of German counterattacks. There was even a rare appearance by the German Luftwaffe.
That's where I was bombed at 250-pound or 500-pound. There's not much difference in them when they get that big. Hit the front yard of the building, only 20 to 30 feet from the building itself. I had only made it about halfway down the stairway when the bombs hit. And the concussion from it and so forth blew me the rest of the way down against the wall, and I turned around a couple of times because it blew me down. And I came out on the floor on my hands and knees sliding across the floor, and the German woman that lived there in that building, after it's over and the plane is gone, of course, by this time, and she looks at me and she sort of grins or laughs like and points at me, you know, because she thought it was so funny the way I came down that stair and on my knees, hands and knees on the floor.
General Lightning Joe Collins believed his men had a golden opportunity to charge through the Siegfried Line while its defences were still only half occupied. But instead, he was informed that the vital supplies his men needed to continue their offensive were to be diverted elsewhere. After 4 days of combat, General Collins was forced to suspend his attack on the Siegfried Line. The cause was a severe Allied supply shortage that even ingenious logistical improvisation couldn't solve.
Because they don't have enough rail capacity, the Americans at the end of August establish what's called the Red Ball Express, which is they treat French roads as if they're a railway. They make them one way only and establish a circuit for trucks travelling at their height, apparently one every 15 to 30 seconds, down the road to drop off its load, come back again as rapidly as possible. And that lasts through into October. But ultimately, the Allies just can't sustain the number of men with the fuel and with the equipment, with the ammunition they need to maintain the broad front without slowing down.
The Allies only had enough supplies for one major attack at a time, and priority was now switched to British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's Operation Market Garden. This was a plan to outflank the Siegfried Line to the north, advancing through the Netherlands, over the Rhine and into Germany in a single bold operation. The plan relied on airborne troops seizing and holding several key river bridges, but Monty believed if it succeeded, it could win the war that year. The fallout was that Lightning Joe's 7th Corps and other units in the area would no longer get the fuel and ammo they needed to continue their own attack. The Allies had handed exhausted German forces a crucial breathing space, one their new commander would use to completely overhaul German defences. That new commander was Field Marshal Walter Model, a man so adept at fixing a crisis that he'd been nicknamed the Führer's fireman. Widely regarded as Germany's best defensive general, he was also known for his loyal support for Adolf Hitler and unsympathetic, no-nonsense attitude to those under his command.
He did an awful lot in a short space of time, reorganising units and preparing the defence. And in this, his experience was an ideal background, because he had fought so many defensive battles on the Eastern Front.
The fact that he is a completely driven, also committed soldier are summed up by many accounts that we see, that he was very tough and very hard against his own troops, because he really wanted to achieve things, but also very hard and tough against himself, and for that the people admired and respected him.
Model's Army Group B was responsible for defending the Belgian and Luxembourg frontier with Germany. The area around Aachen was held by the 81st Corps of General Brandenberger's 7th Army. Many of its divisions had been almost completely destroyed during the fighting in France and remained severely under strength. The Corps' 2 panzer divisions could muster barely 20 tanks between them. But through September, reinforcements continued to arrive, including replacement tanks and new Volksgrenadier divisions.
In the autumn of 1944, the Germans built a new type of force, and these forces were the Volksgrenadier divisions. The problem was, for the Germans, the manpower shortage of 1944. So the Volksgrenadier divisions had a lower number of infantry battalions, so the manpower was quite low, and they tried to, at least in theory, overcome that by equipping them with more machines, in particular infantry weapons. What they also tried to achieve was that you would have a very experienced cadre of officers and NCOs, around which you would then form a body of men, maybe recruited from people back from the Reich who hadn't been drafted before, and also, in particular, from surplus numbers from the Air Force and from the Navy that were not being used anymore. This was the theory. In reality, it didn't really work that way. And so even though on paper these are very formidable formations, in reality, they were not as formidable, not as strong, not as good as perhaps the standard units that you would find in the army.
Zusammengewürfelt. Man sah ja auch die verschiedensten Uniformen. Nicht wahr? Dort hatte einer eine Luftwaffenmontur an und es gab auch Leute mit Marinekleidung.
While US forces paused their attack on the Siegfried Line, Nazi officials began to evacuate civilians from the city of Aachen, now threatened by the Allied advance. For Germany, Aachen had limited military value, but great symbolic importance.
Aachen was a deeply historic German city. It had been in existence for hundreds, if not thousands of years. It was Charlemagne's capital during the Frankish Empire, and so the Germans really treasured the city as a historic monument to their nation, to their history. In addition, it was the first major German city that was being attacked by the Allies, and so there was this sense that Germany herself was now under threat.
But Gerhard von Schwerin, commander of 116th Panzer, had already drafted a letter surrendering the city to the Americans.
But he never sent that letter because German reinforcements are rushed into the area and a counterattack is ordered, which stabilizes the front for some time, which then leads to rather heavy fighting in that particular area. This letter, say, was never sent, but it did make its way towards, or through the channels, you might say, towards Hitler, who basically wanted Schwerin persecuted and probably shot, but he very narrowly escaped that particular fate, so he was very lucky.
Meanwhile, to the north, after a week of intense fighting, Montgomery's Operation Market Garden ended in failure, as British troops were unable to break through to airborne units holding Arnhem Bridge. Lightning Joe's 7th Corps would now get the supplies it needed to resume its attack on the Siegfried Line around Aachen. They'd be joined in the battle for the city by the US 19th Corps. September's advance by Collins' 7th Corps had left it holding the Stolberg Corridor, southeast of Aachen. North of the city, 19th Corps launched its attack across the Rur River near Übach, with the intention of swinging south to link up with US 1st Infantry east of Aachen, cutting off the city. 19th Corps' attack was preceded by major airstrikes, but fighter bombers failed to register a direct hit on a single pillbox, while the artillery's high-explosive shells weren't powerful enough to penetrate the concrete bunkers. They would have to be taken by infantry assault. US combat engineers trained infantry units for challenges like this.
We'd take an infantry platoon and have them get a sheep and take the sheep and put it inside the pillbox, and then go out and then have a sample assault where we'd assault the back door, flamethrower into it, fire bazooka into it, then put the 26-pound charge down the center in. And as soon as that charge went off, then we had the infantry run inside and told them to get that sheep. When they brought it out, they found the sheep was bleeding from its ears and eyes from the shock and concussion. And the infantrymen all decided they didn't want to be inside of a pillbox.
Using tactics like these, 30th Infantry Division captured 50 German pillboxes on the first day. But it was slow attritional fighting, and by the third day, 19th Corps had taken 1,800 casualties. On the 8th of October, 7th Corps' 1st Infantry Division joined the attack, taking Crucifix Hill, east of Aachen. But as the noose tightened around the city, there were fewer signs than ever that the Germans were about to give up.
Aachen was the first German city under attack, and the population of the city itself was German. German troops were defending not only their homeland, but German civilians themselves. Both of those things made the German soldiers very motivated to fight hard and fight for a long time.
By the 11th of October, US forces had surrounded the city. An ultimatum from the commander of the US 1st Infantry Division for the city to surrender or face destruction was rejected. And so American aircraft and artillery began to pulverize German positions in and around Aachen. Most civilians had been evacuated, but around 20,000 remained in the city, now trapped by fierce fighting. American infantry evolved new tactics for advancing through the streets. They made use of their overwhelming firepower to demolish entire houses if need be, to silence German resistance points. The cut-off German defenders, 5,000 men from a mix of units, fought stubbornly. But without outside help, their situation was hopeless. And so, east of Aachen, German forces launched a counterattack to try to break the American grip on the city. A regiment of the US 1st Infantry found itself facing the latest German heavy tanks, more powerful than even the legendary Tiger.
Despite the impressive nature of the Tiger I, the German military stops making them in the summer of 1944, and they move on to an even more impressive beast, the King Tiger or Royal Tiger, Tiger II. And that's built because Hitler insists that the newer 88mm gun, which is even longer, even more powerful, is put on a tank chassis. Hitler's idea is that every year the German military must have a superior vehicle than whatever the enemy are going to be fielding.
When Frank Kamm arrived at the front, he met comrades who had been there when the dreaded Tigers came rolling in.
I visited the engineers up there, and they told me about a Tiger tank that could just run right over their tanks, friendly mines, and roll down the street and stopped at each building and fired around into the basement of the building and kept rolling along, and then turned around at the end of the road and came back firing in the building on the other side of the road. And they were so tough that they couldn't stop them. So those things were scary.
But the Germans only had a handful of these powerful tanks, not enough to turn the tide of the battle. 11 days after the US ultimatum, with much of the city in ruins, Aachen's last German defenders surrendered. It was the Western Allies' longest battle for a city in World War II. Both sides suffered about 5,000 casualties, with 3,500 German soldiers taken prisoner. But the battle to break the Siegfried Line was not over yet, and the next phase would prove an even more challenging environment. 10 miles southeast of Aachen, the Siegfried Line wound through the dense pines and steep ravines of the Hürtgen Forest. Efforts to break the line here would lead to some of the most grueling and costly fighting on the Western Front. While 7th Corps' 1st Infantry Division had been fighting in Aachen, the 9th had plunged into the Hürtgen Forest, an area covering around 50 square miles south of Aachen. Corps Commander Major General Lightning Joe Collins had decided that if the forest remained in German hands, it would give the enemy an ideal base from which to threaten his southern flank as his men advanced east from Aachen. But the American decision to fight through this almost impassable terrain puzzled the Germans.
Wir auf deutscher Seite haben uns eigentlich immer gewundert, weshalb die Amerikaner versuchten, durch den Hürtgenwald zu kommen. Die hatten eine Überlegenheit mit Panzern von, sagen wir mal, 20:1 oder noch mehr. Die wären von Aachen aus mit ihren Panzern in wenigen Tagen über die Ebene am Rhein gewesen. Nein, die wollten unbedingt durch den dichten Hürtgenwald.
Hidden amongst the thick pine woods were concrete pillboxes, supported by minefields, trenches and wooden bunkers. The few routes through the forest wide enough for tanks were littered with mines. One American unit counted a German anti-tank mine every 8 paces for 3 miles. In the face of such formidable defences, it took the 9th Infantry 10 days to advance just 3,000 yards, at the cost of 4,500 casualties. It set the pattern for weeks of grueling combat as more and more units were committed in an effort to bludgeon their way through the forest. In late October, the worn-out 9th Division was relieved by fresh troops of the Pennsylvanian 28th Infantry, in preparation for a new phase of the American battle to break through the Siegfried Line. The 28th Division had arrived in France a few weeks after D-Day. Its 3 infantry regiments had seen heavy fighting in Normandy, before marching down the Champs-Élysées in the parade to celebrate the liberation of Paris. But Hürtgen Forest would be unlike anything the division had seen or trained for. The 28th Division was to play a key role in the Allied advance towards the next objective, the Rur River. It would make a preliminary attack through the Hürtgen Forest to capture the important crossroads town of Schmidt and secure the flank of the main advance. This would be followed by the main attack, codenamed Operation Queen, which would see 7th Corps and 19th Corps push east towards their objective, the main town of Düren on the Ruhr. But a US advance through the Hürtgen Forest would threaten secret German preparations for a major winter offensive in the Ardennes Forest.
Unbeknownst to the Americans, their advance on Schmidt presented a serious strategic threat to the Germans. If the Americans captured Schmidt, they would actually be able to threaten the German buildup areas for the Ardennes counteroffensive. And so the Germans realized that they had to defend both the Hürtgen Forest and Schmidt itself against the American assault, because otherwise the entire counteroffensive would become difficult, if not impossible.
The US 28th Division would face heavier resistance than expected, and its commander already had serious concerns about his orders. The division was led by General Norman Dutch Cota, a career soldier and West Point graduate who'd become a D-Day legend after coming ashore at Omaha Beach with the second wave and personally leading a charge through the enemy wire. He'd won the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions that day, and 2 months later was given command of the 28th Infantry Division, after its previous commander was killed by a German sniper. Cota didn't believe his division was experienced or strong enough to clear the Germans from the forest. But his complaints fell on deaf ears, and on the 2nd of November, the 28th Division began its attack. Many GIs advanced through the forest with a sense of dread.
We didn't, of course, know where we were. We had no idea what we were in. Each of us was wanting the same thing. Which one of us is going to get killed first? Is one of us going to get that $1 million wound to go home? Is one of us going to get an arm blown off? We're going into combat, and they're shooting real bullets up there.
One regiment immediately walked into a large, unmarked minefield. Another was ambushed by expertly camouflaged German pillboxes in the forest and pinned down.
Die Amerikaner griffen an, die sahen uns nicht, wir waren ja bestens getarnt. Und greifen sie mal in der Dunkelheit und im Nebel und bei diesem Witterungsverhältnis Infanterie an, die in eingegrabenen Stellungen sitzen. Das ist die Hölle.
On the 3rd of November, American infantry took the town of Schmidt. Model, alarmed at the threat to preparations for the German winter offensive through the Ardennes, immediately ordered powerful counterattacks. At dawn the following day, German infantry attacked, supported by tanks of the 116th Panzer Division. The single American battalion holding Schmidt had no tanks or anti-tank guns to take on the panzers, just bazookas. It was clear that the 28th Division was going to lose all its gains without immediate tank support. But getting 35-ton tanks up the forest trails had so far proved impossible. Army engineers were now given just a few hours to make the forest trail to Schmidt passable using hand tools and a single bulldozer. 3 Shermans finally made it up the track, just in time to help fight off the German panzer's counterattack. But the lead US regiment was under sustained assault by the best part of 2 German divisions. The Germans retook Schmidt, while the Americans desperately held out in the neighboring village of Kommerscheid. The forest was so dense it was impossible to maintain a front line, so infiltration and flanking attacks by small squads of infantry were a constant threat. General Cota, for all his famed courage, was struggling to hold his division together, issuing orders for counterattacks that were so unrealistic, some junior commanders simply ignored them.
We had been let down by the senior officers. They simply didn't understand what was going on. They'd wipe out a company, and then they'd send another company in to do exactly the same attack that had failed before. They didn't seem to be learning from it.
Bad decisions led to thousands of casualties. Up to a third were classed as non-battle and included trench foot, frostbite and dysentery. But combat took its toll in many ways, and prolonged exposure to battle resulted in psychological disorders. 26% of all US troops who served in combat units between June and November 1944 reported sick with combat fatigue at some time or another.
As more and more men broke down because of combat fatigue, rather than being punished, they were taken off the line, they were treated. Some of them were sent back home for good. A lot of them were given a chance to recover. But the Army handled them pretty effectively over the long term because they knew that this was just something that happened to every soldier eventually. The other thing about combat fatigue was that the other soldiers recognized it and weren't dismissive or contemptuous of the men who experienced it. To a certain extent, there was a sense that, oh, this could be me. And so they tended to treat those folks who broke down mentally in combat with a kind of rough kindness.
In extreme cases, the misery and dread of frontline service drove some soldiers to go absent without leave.
Desertion was also a serious problem, and the only US soldier to actually be shot for desertion during the course of the war was Private Eddie Slovic. And that was a result of this campaign.
The decision to execute Eddie Slovic was approved by Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, deeply concerned by low morale among US units that winter. Slovic had been part of the ill-fated 28th Division, which continued to struggle forward through the Hürtgen Forest. General Lightning Joe Collins had planned for the 7th Corps to reinforce the division as part of a major attack codenamed Operation Queen on the 5th of November. But bad weather delayed the preliminary air bombardment for day after day. The 28th Division were left in the forest to bear the brunt of the German counterattacks on their own. Then, in the midst of the fighting, along a fiercely contested supply route through the forest known as the Cowl Trail, there was a moment of rare and courageous mercy.
Sind wir zu den Amerikanern mit einer weißen Fahne hingegangen, rübergegangen. Sie waren auf der anderen Seite des Flusses, der Kall.
3 times a day for 5 days, both sides paused the fighting and came together to help evacuate wounded soldiers. Dr. Gunther Stüttgen was a medic for the German 89th Infantry Division.
Ich hatte in meinem Bunker immer amerikanische Sanitätssoldaten, die mir halfen bei der Versorgung von amerikanischen Verwundeten, die antransportiert wurden. Und dann machte ich ihnen klar, dass sie keine Gefangenen wären und sie könnten wieder zurückgehen.
They even devised a way of sharing the water of the Cowl River without the fear of being attacked.
Hatte den Vorschlag gemacht, bin zu den entsprechenden Offizieren gegangen und habe denen gesagt, also lass uns doch die Deutschen hier waschen sich von 8 bis 9 und ihr von ab 9 bis 10. Ja? Und das war eine Abmachung, die eben auch eingehalten wurde. Das erinnerte jetzt nachblickend in der Analyse, es war fast kriegsspielartig.
But the respite was short-lived. On the 16th of November, with no end to the bad weather in sight, General Hodges ordered Operation Queen to go ahead, with or without the bombers. Miraculously, after 13 days of constant rain, the weather cleared at the last moment. More than 1,500 heavy bombers poured high explosive onto Siegfried Line defences and towns along the Rur River valley.
The effects were devastating. The towns that were hit by the bombers were basically obliterated. The communication lines were cut, and the effects on the morale, particularly of the inexperienced soldiers, was quite severe. Having said that, in the combat zone itself, where you had more of the experienced German soldiers, the effects were far less. There are a number of reasons for this. First of all, the bombing wasn't all that accurate in that particular area, and also a lot of the more experienced soldiers and their morale were not hit that badly. And it's interesting that after the bombing raid, even the Allied commanders said that the bombing had not lived up to their expectations.
In the aftermath of the bombing raid, Collins' 7th Corps launched its attack through and north of the Hürtgen Forest. They'd have to fight their way through a series of well-defended villages with the aim of securing new priority objectives, the Rur River dams, the significance of which had only just been grasped.
During the fighting, the Germans were thinking of blowing the dams of the River Rur. The idea behind that was that by blowing the dams, well, first of all, they would create a water wall which would move towards the Allies and hopefully sweep away some of the troops. But even more importantly, it would create a bit of, you might say, a swamp area and would widen the River Rur to about 1.5 kilometers, which made it very, very difficult for the Allies to cross. So creating a rather severe water obstacles to the advancing Allies.
The Americans knew that the Rur dams were there, but they had sort of lost focus on them in an attempt to secure their flank by taking the Hürtgen Forest. General Hodges of the American Army wasn't the most intelligent, most aggressive commander, and he was having trouble tracking everything that was going on. In the process, the dams sort of got lost in the mess.
US commanders finally understood that they could not safely cross the Rur River while the dams remained intact in German hands. But the shattered 28th Division would take no part in this attack. Cota's men were finally being pulled out of the line.
I felt, oh my God, we're getting out of this meat grinder. And the next day we got on the trucks and away we went. Down the mountains, over the rivers, through the woods. It was like luxury.
But for the veteran US 1st Infantry Division, it was the start of their Hürtgen Forest ordeal. On the first day of Operation Queen, they attacked the village of Hamish, where Harley Reynolds and his unit encountered a lethal new German infantry weapon.
The Germans had developed a pistol that shot a grenade, and they had developed this pistol. The idea was there all the time, but we'd never run up against them until this night. And they had developed it was a flare gun. Shoots a flare, just like you carry on your boat, for an example, if you're out on the water. But instead of a flare, it shot a grenade. Now, this is close quarters. You're talking about 20 to 30 yards. But that was one wicked thing, and it's our first time to ever run up against it. And they just slaughtered us. And it was 23 people that was left from the company.
It took 4 days for the 1st Division to take Hamish, at the cost of 1,000 casualties. Fighting the terrain, as well as a well-entrenched and skillful enemy, American infantry advanced at a snail's pace, about 1.5 miles in 5 days. American armor struggled in the muddy, heavily mined tracks of the forest. What's more, they were stalked by German infantry, equipped with handheld anti-tank weapons.
So the Panzerfaust can be used by units like the Volksgrenadiers in the Hürtgen Forest. They can creep up on tanks through the woods, and this very simple weapon can penetrate the armor on the front or the sides of a Sherman tank. So literally pennies are being used to knock out thousands of pounds worth of equipment.
All units in the Hürtgen Forest suffered a horrifying rate of attrition. For those on the front line, the nightmare seemed unending. Americans had given the forest a grisly nickname, the Death Factory. And with winter closing in, conditions were only getting more miserable.
I'd have to describe it in this way. In the beginning of winter, back in Virginia, where I grew up, it starts with a very cold blowing wind and just snow flakes, just here and there. But the flakes aren't actually flakes. They're in little balls like pellets. And that was all I saw of snow in the Hürtgen Forest while I was there. We knew the winter was coming.
November 1944. The US 1st and 9th Armies were waging a grim winter offensive along a 15-mile front in an attempt to push through the Siegfried Line to the Rur River and then on to the Rhine itself. On the southern flank of the advance, US infantry were pinned down in the Hürtgen Forest, unable to make any headway through the wooded maze of ravines, minefields, and bunkers.
Dadurch alles das, was jetzt am Boden lag, konnten sich eigentlich in keiner Hinsicht still bewegen. Sie machten immer Krach, irgendwo knackte immer irgendwas. Und das hat natürlich die eine wie die andere Seite bemerkt und da wurde dann Feuer eröffnet.
One US regiment lost 200 men in a single day, and all 3 of its battalion commanders. Losses were so bad that some companies got through 3 or 4 commanding officers in a month. Many were below half their normal strength of 190 men. The need for replacements was more urgent than ever. But when new recruits were sent to frontline units to replace the casualties, they often struggled to fit in amongst the veterans.
The American manpower system was one of the great failings of American organization during World War II. The Americans, rather than pulling units off the line when they experienced heavy casualties and rebuilding them, would simply send out individual soldiers as replacements. And this IRR, individual ready replacement system, turned out to not work very well at all. Among other things, it meant that they were sending new soldiers to veteran units who didn't know them, who had no connection to them, who had no chance to train with them ahead of time. And those units weren't terribly welcoming.
But the veterans weren't simply trying to be cruel. They were protecting themselves.
So these new replacements would come out and they would be incredibly vulnerable the first couple of weeks with the new unit, because they just didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know what the sound of a German machine gun was like compared to the sound of an American. They didn't know how to move through forests quietly. And so not only would they get themselves killed, but they'd get the other soldiers killed. One of the results of this, in a kind of horrifying way, is that a lot of the veteran soldiers refused to even learn the names of the replacements until they'd been with the unit long enough that those veteran soldiers had some sense that they would survive. It wasn't worth getting to know the new guy if he was just going to be dead the next day.
You know, big boys don't cry, you know, and you're not supposed to get so attached. And that's the thing we tried not to do, because we get new replacements, get to know them by their first name, 2 days later they're dead. And we're talking about 70% turnover all the time. If we had an 8-man squad, which is supposed to be 12, we thought that was a big deal. Hardly ever remember being full strength. They just killed us all the time.
In the last week of November, fresh attacks were made by 5th Corps towards Grosshau at the eastern edge of the forest and the town of Hürtgen. American infantry faced all the usual problems of fighting through the Hürtgen Forest. At Grosshau, just 2 Sherman tanks made it up the trails to support the attack. Both were immediately knocked out by German assault guns. At Hürtgen, American tanks coming up the road encountered craters and anti-tank mines. The lead tanks were soon immobilized, blocking the road for those behind. But thanks to a sudden break in the weather, Allied fighter-bombers were able to strafe and bomb German positions, and US infantry eventually took both villages. The American advance was inching forward at the cost of enormous casualties. And still, the Rur River dams were not in sight. And so Allied commanders turned to air power to destroy them. In early December, RAF bombers attacked the dams 3 times, but there was no repeat of the spectacular Dam Busters' success. The dams were made of packed earth and almost impossible to hit amid constant winter cloud cover. They would have to be taken by ground troops after all. Frank Cam's unit arrived at the front on the 13th of December and quickly got a taste of the fog of war in the freezing forest.
We had several different infantry platoons attack that first night on the 13th of December, and some of our soldiers got caught behind German lines. While it was dark, they had to try to get out, and they came across a German trench and were walking through the German trench when they ran into German soldiers. And the Germans would say something to them, and they just grunted back and kept on going. And they walked through the German lines and then came on out. So sometimes you engage them, and if they don't know who you are, you're all right.
German soldiers were also under immense pressure and faced the terrifying might of Allied firepower.
Und nachts war ich alleine. Nur Krachen, keine Verbindung mehr. Ich kann nur sagen, es kurz zu sagen, in dieser Nacht habe ich beten gelernt.
US troops, with the advantage in numbers and firepower, made steady progress towards the Rur River, while Hill 400, a crucial vantage point, was taken by an elite US Ranger battalion in a head-on charge. After months of bitter fighting, US 1st and 9th Armies finally reached the Rur River. Siegfried Line defenses, the horrors of Hürtgen Forest, and a skillful German defense meant they'd been forced to pay an exceptionally heavy price, and still hadn't made the breakthrough they'd hoped for. But as American commanders prepared for yet another assault towards the Ruhr dams, on the 16th of December, 25 miles to the south, Hitler launched a surprise midwinter offensive through the Ardennes forest. It was the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last great offensive in the west, and meant troops in the Hürtgen Forest would be left holding their positions for the rest of a harsh winter.
At that point, the Battle of the Bulge was triggered, which went from December of 1944 into January of 45. They had pulled away all of our artillery support, all of our air support, and we had to dig in at the Rur River. It was cold and miserable, and fighting through the elements was a war in itself for us.
It was an indecisive end to a deeply flawed Allied campaign.
Hürtgen Forest was probably one of the bigger setbacks for the Allies on the Western Front. It was intended to really break through the Siegfried Line in that area, and it didn't do that. And in addition, the Allies took massive casualties fighting their way through the terrain of the forest itself. And so the final result is they didn't really achieve what they were aiming for, and they lost more than 30,000 casualties doing it.
The defense of the Hürtgen Forest can be seen as a German victory. The Germans inflicted higher casualties on the Allies, the Americans, than they sustained themselves. The Germans lose somewhere in the region of about 28,000 casualties, whereas the Americans lose about 33,000 casualties, plus about 9,000 non-combat casualties. So some of the units have a 25% casualty rate, which is extremely high for American units. So at that particular level, yes, you might say it was a victory. It also slowed down the Allied advance, and the Germans were able to hold on to more of their territory. From an operational and strategic point of view, the answer is probably different. You might say, well, operationally it didn't really achieve all that much, where strategically it didn't have any effect at all, and Germany still lost the war.
The duration and intensity of fighting in the Hürtgen Forest would traumatize survivors on all sides.
Ich sehe dort heute noch die ganzen Toten liegen. Die amerikanischen Soldaten und deutschen Soldaten, alles gemischt, die ganzen Felder voll.
General Dutch Cota's battered 28th Division, who'd been left out on a limb in Hürtgen Forest, were moved south to a quiet sector to recover. But in a grim irony, they found themselves in the path of Hitler's surprise winter offensive through the Ardennes. Not until the Battle of the Bulge had been won could Allied forces along the Siegfried Line resume their offensive and begin the final advance into the heart of Nazi Germany.